What might have happened if the Nazis had developed a nuclear bomb? Few events in history caused more deaths than World War II, but there are a number of junctures where things could have gone even worse, changing the course of history. After Germany surrendered to the Allies on May 8, 1945, VE Day, Japan was the last of the three Axis powers standing. Italy had surrendered way back in 1943, and there was no guarantee that Japan would ever do the same. After all, this was the same country that resorted to desperate kamikaze attacks. Prior to Japan's surrender, the United States had plans, including even more firebombing campaigns and a possible full-scale invasion. There was also the possibility that the already hungry Japanese population would starve if the war continued. After the United States dropped an atomic bomb in Hiroshima, Emperor Hirohito knew his country needed to surrender.
This city is now doomed.
But not everyone in the government agreed with him, even after a second nuclear attack on Nagasaki. In a last-ditch attempt to keep Japan from surrendering, members of the government and the Imperial Guard tried to foment a coup and stop the emperor's plan. On the night of August 14, 1945, Kenji Hatanaka and Jiro Shizaki led other rebels to the Imperial Palace, where they successfully took control of the compound. Thankfully, the attempt failed because the rebels were unable to locate the emperor or the declaration of surrender, and no military leaders agreed to support their attempt to keep Japan in the war. When FDR stood in front of Congress, he had choice words to say about December 7, 1941.
A date which will live in infamy.
Despite the staggering tragedy, it could have been much worse. While a successful sneak attack in many respects, the destruction of Pearl Harbor barely put a dent in the United States Pacific Fleet. The Japanese pilots only hit 18 of 96 ships, and all three aircraft carriers just happened to be out at sea at the time. Furthermore, the US was actually very lucky that it was a complete surprise. Had they expected an attack to happen at any moment, there's no way the Navy would have left Pearl Harbor undefended by its aircraft carriers. But with Japan countering with a force of 6 carriers, the outnumbered US could have lost anywhere from 33 to 100% of its most vital ships in the coming war. Because the attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't entirely successful, plans were quickly drawn up for a second attack on the military base. The code name for a second planned mission was Operation K, and it was to take place several months after the first. This follow-up was never meant to do the kind of destruction the original did. It was meant to cause additional damage, disrupt repair work at the base, and damage morale. The plan was for 5 long-range Kawanishi H-8K planes to drop 4 550-pound bombs on the base. But the flights would also gather reconnaissance information on how quickly repairs from the original attack were going. The Japanese needed to know when the US Navy in the Pacific would be back up to full strength. Luckily for the US war efforts, when the conditions were right for the attack on March 4, 1942, only 2 of the planned 5 Japanese planes were available. In a record-breaking flight, the aircraft flew over 2,000 miles round trip from the Marshall Islands to Hawaii. More went wrong along the way. Not only were the planes detected by US forces, but thick cloud cover also resulted in them being separated and unable to properly aim the bombs. In the end, the explosives fell into the ocean and near a school. They caused little damage and no one was killed. On paper, Spanish dictator Francisco Franco would have been the perfect ally for Adolf Hitler during World War II. They were both dictators of fascist governments, and Franco was open about his Nazi sympathies. German and Italian troops had even assisted in Franco's victory in the Spanish Civil War. Despite all this, Spain stayed neutral during World War II. Had the country ever decided to join the fight on the side of the Axis, Hitler would have been ready with plans that would have been disastrous for the Allies. Perhaps the biggest concern would be Franco's demand for Gibraltar. Britain had conquered the Rock off the coast of southern Spain in 1713, and Spain wanted it back. If Hitler had been forced to commit to taking Gibraltar in order to get Franco to enter the war, and had he succeeded in invading the island, the Allies would have lost access to the Mediterranean, as well as a key location for planning and launching military campaigns in North Africa. Fortunately for the Allies, the two dictators were never able to come to an agreement on terms, despite serious attempts to come to a deal almost all the way up to 1943. But while Franco provided support to the side he wanted to win through trade and propaganda, he never committed Spanish troops to the war. Following the fall of France, the Battle of Dunkirk marked the tragic culmination of a devastating period for the Allies early in World War II. Pretty much the only good thing for the Allies was that Hitler made a crucial mistake in the Battle of Dunkirk. He delayed sending in the tanks that would have wiped out the Allied forces. Instead, they had several days to mount a massive evacuation by sea to Britain.
A gigantic defeat which was turned into a moral victory.
Hitler had driven the opposing forces out of mainland Europe, but he had also failed to destroy them so completely that an Allied surrender would be conceivable. With this in mind, he began planning for his next logical step, invading England. Had the Germans successfully invaded the island, World War II would have been a completely different story. After being forced out of continental Europe, Britain became the epicenter of planning and organizing the D-Day landings, and it was the only location the Allies controlled that would have allowed for a successful invasion of France. Hitler began massing ships at ports in northern France. The Luftwaffe was tasked with destroying the Royal Air Force so German ships could safely cross the English Channel, but they never managed to do this. The invasion of England, which Hitler originally wanted completed by August 10, 1940, kept being pushed back as the Nazis waited for the conditions to improve. While Hitler never officially canceled Operation Sea Lion, the perfect conditions never materialized before Germany's defeat. The United States wasn't the only country racing to harness the power of the atom. Indeed, the what-ifs of an alternate scenario where the Nazis succeeded in getting a nuke sent shivers down the spines of historians. While it turned out that the Nazis were nowhere near successfully cracking the problem of nuclear weapons, the Allies knew they were trying. We even had the mysterious cube that the Nazis may have used when they tried to build an atomic bomb. And while some of the most brilliant scientific minds in the world were German, many of them, including Albert Einstein and Erwin Schrödinger, had fled the country after Adolf Hitler's rise to power. While the Nazis still had Werner Heisenberg, the Allies had the upper hand in terms of physicists on their side. If the Nazis had overcome other problems they faced and built the bomb, there is no way of knowing what Hitler would have done with the superweapon. It is possible he might have chosen not to use it, or even that using it would not have been as effective on a huge country like the Soviet Union as the nuclear bombs were on Japan. It is just as likely he could have used them strategically and won the war. When Italy invaded Egypt on September 13, 1940, it was clear what their ultimate objective was: take control of the Suez Canal. The waterway was vital for shipping, and since 1936 it had been guarded by British troops who were now desperately outnumbered. Had German troops shown up to support their Italian allies, there was a very good chance they would have succeeded in controlling the canal. Hitler knew this, and he offered the necessary troops. It was Benito Mussolini who refused the help. It turned out that the dictators were a bit at odds at the time, with Mussolini upset that Hitler had rejected Italy's offer to assist in the Battle of Britain. Mussolini believed that taking the Suez Canal without German support would restore Italy's pride. This was extremely lucky for the Allies. The Nazi forces would have been a far more formidable opponent, as the Italian troops were not as well trained. On June 13th and June 17th, 1942, 8 Nazi saboteurs were smuggled into the US with explosives and tens of thousands of dollars in cash. They had a detailed plan to spend the next 2 years blowing things up, with the goal of hindering military production, creating panic, and lowering morale in America, which had only entered the war about 7 months before. There was every chance the Nazis would succeed, as they were well-financed and well-prepared. After 18 days at a special training camp in Germany where they learned the finer points of terrorism, 2 groups of 4 each landed in Florida and Long Island. All 8 men had previously lived in the US, but they were not experts in this kind of warfare. For the New York group, things immediately went wrong. George John Dash almost drowned getting from the U-boat to shore. While laying on the sand recovering, he was discovered by a member of the Coast Guard. For some baffling reason, the saboteurs landed wearing their Nazi uniforms. Dash attempted to bribe the man, $260, which is around the value of $5,000 today, but still, that wasn't enough to sell out his country, and he subsequently reported the incident to the FBI. Dash made it easier for law enforcement by turning himself in and spilling everything. The men faced serious consequences. 6 were executed by electric chair on August 8, 1942. Dash was originally sentenced to death, but this was commuted to a 30-year sentence, while the 8th conspirator's death sentence was commuted to life in prison. While World War II resulted in the deaths of many more people, certain aspects of World War I were arguably more horrific. One of the main reasons? The poison gas that was regularly used on the battlefield not only caused unbelievably painful deaths, but it also left surviving soldiers with injuries, including scarring and blindness. The Axis and the Allied countries both had access to stocks of chemical weapons a quarter of a century later, and it's easy to see a scenario where the leaders of one or both sides could have gotten desperate enough to use them. We may never know why neither side, but especially the Germans, resorted to using gas, but there are theories. It may be that since Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt were still traumatized by the effects of poison gas on World War I soldiers, they chose not to use chemical weapons on the battlefield during World War II. The Axis and the Allies were equally concerned that if they made the first move and used chemical warfare on the battlefield, the other side would respond in kind. After the fall of France, it was clear that defeating the Axis would be impossible unless Allied troops managed to regain a foothold on the continent of Europe. This meant that there was no great mystery about what they would eventually do. Adolf Hitler knew the Allies would attempt an amphibious assault somewhere in Western Europe. The question was, where? The Allies knew that maintaining the secrecy of their plan was vital. If Hitler had predicted where they would invade, he would have made sure to build up the German military presence in that area, meaning D-Day's chances of success would have been seriously hampered. General Dwight Eisenhower was aware of the chances of failure, even if the attack was largely a surprise, and wrote a statement taking responsibility for the failure of D-Day should the worst happen. To keep Hitler guessing, the Allied powers went to huge lengths to make it look like they were planning to land somewhere else. Despite many complicated deceptions, some of Hitler's underlings still managed to correctly predict that the Allied invasion would be at Normandy. Fortunately, Hitler disagreed, or the war could have ended much differently.